If you want to get fluent in a language, then you must immerse and ideally go abroad to the country. That is what they want us to believe, at least. And I know that not everyone has the opportunity to just go off the grid for about 3 months. I consider myself extremely lucky to go and take 3 months and study Turkish intensively. Did I pass the B2 exam, and with doing so, achieve a lifelong language goal of mine? Yes. Am I grateful to have the experience? Also yes. And was it overall a good experience? I hesitate to really answer that one. And this is what I want to exhibit in this video. My honest experience learning Turkish, all the cons, all the pros, and all of the advice as well, if you are looking to do something similar with Turkish or even with another language. I think we need to have a lot more authenticity and honesty, transparency in some of the language learning communities that I see online. I don't think there's as much discussion about what really goes on behind the scenes of learning a language. I want you to know with this video not only the advice that I have from my own experience, but to let you know that you're not alone in how you feel. And it's important to keep on sharing our stories with other people so that they also don't forget that they're not alone. Starting with the fact that we need to be honest about not always connecting with a language and a culture. That's really my first con, right? Because just because you learn a language, no matter if you reach a high level or not, it does not guarantee that you personally, as who you are always going to connect with the language and the culture and the people behind the language all the time. And this disconnect will grow even stronger and even more apparent when you are in the country itself, as it did for me. And you can force yourself into ways, possibilities to build connection, but you can't force connection itself. And that was one of the main things that I faced in Istanbul. And I went out almost every weekend putting myself in those situations to make connections, and it just didn't really happen. And even though I loved the language, that didn't make up for the fact that I wasn't connecting to the culture, to the history of Istanbul, right? Because it's a very historic city, it's beautiful, but there wasn't any sort of spark. In fact, after about 2 months, I was already ready to leave Istanbul. I wish I had booked a shorter course, to be honest. So much of understanding the language and building our listening comprehension, our overall fluency in the language is really understanding the culture and the cultural context. So we can really use the language in its most authentic form. And because I was facing a lot of barriers with not wanting to accept really that I didn't connect with Turkish culture as much as I did maybe in the past with Italian culture. That was really a huge barrier for me to even want to stay longer and even want to go past a B2 in Turkish once I did finish my B2 exam. Now, people in the comments will definitely come at me and say, hey, like you need to go back to Turkey. Why didn't you go to a smaller city? You should. I think you'll have a different experience. I also need to be honest and say, why should I have to do that? Like, there are so many cultures in the world. I won't be able to connect with all of them, no matter if I study their language or not, right? And I have to prioritize things in my own life. What if I don't want to go back to Turkey? What if I got out of this language what I wanted to? Even if that means, not going to the highest level ever, not even going to C1, right? I actually decided to not finish the C1 exam, and I started to skip probably a good 2 weeks of the C1 course after I finished the B2 course, because it just was not in line with me. And again, the disconnect from the culture and the people was so strong that it just presented a barrier that was actually a signal for me to say, hey, Emily, you need to stop, and it's time for you to listen to your intuition and pick another language, basically. Which normally I wouldn't be disappointed by that, but I think it was really being in such an intensive environment and knowing, not everyone can do this, and I should be grateful for this experience by, going to class, but I can be easily grateful for the same experience and make it so it suits my needs. And if I figure out that something in the course or the course itself isn't suiting my needs, then why do I still need to go? And it took me a while to understand and own that is my truth that I need to accept about myself, that I don't need a C1, that I don't need to stay in Turkey, that I might never visit Turkey again after I leave, right? And that's okay. I think we need to normalize that more in the language learning communities online, especially when we keep on seeing reels of the most viral language learning content, which involves people just going up to strangers on the streets, speaking their language, and then impressing them and creating an instant connection. We learn languages for connection, and so it's disappointing when we find that we can't forge that connection as much with maybe a previous language I think there's a lot of nuance around this in terms of recognizing the human experience inside of learning a language, because not everything can be bright and wonderful rainbows and butterflies in real life. And so I think when we step into a new culture and language and we try really hard, like we sometimes study for years trying to get to our language learning goals, and when that connection as well doesn't come like we think it should, or in the way that we think it should, right? Then we can set up really discouraging expectations about ourselves. And that was definitely part of my experience. Another con that I definitely experienced was that just because you are in the country doesn't guarantee immersion. Like even in Turkey, where usually the level of English is generally lower, I was still in, and I should have done more research on this actually, I still picked a place where it was very tourist heavy. So there was still a lot of English spoken. My host as well in the accommodation that I was staying with spoke a lot of English. Even when I would try to speak Turkish, a lot of them would try to speak English back to me. Now I did find a trick to this, especially with people who I knew that I, wouldn't stick around for hanging around with a long time. I would usually tell them that I would be from Spain or something, since my Spanish is fluent, and they really couldn't tell me otherwise. And then just tell them, hey, I don't understand English, so that they would stay in the language that I'm trying to practice, especially since they don't know Spanish, right? So I should have done something like that in Turkey, but I didn't, even though I'm doing something similar to that right now while I'm in Jordan, so people will speak more Arabic with me. But even though we had, 4 hours a day of classes, sometimes the speaking in there just wasn't enough, again, because it was a group class too, and just because there was a lot of English around. So I had to set up intentional immersion as a remedy for that, 4 extra conversation private classes per week. Another con is that it is extremely rewarding, but exhaustion definitely comes as the price to pay. I mean, think about it. We're just throwing ourselves into a whole new way of being in our language, right? Especially if we're solo language learners, it's easy to get used to compartmentalizing the language throughout the day. Whereas in another setting, in another environment, in a very academic environment, if you are in a language program or a language school, then it's like you're going to be exhausted, and we forget how cognitively demanding sometimes a language can be to our brains, especially if we force ourselves to do it, 4 hours a day, and then we still have homework after that. I've especially faced a lot of emotional barriers to getting fluent in languages because I was so critical of myself as I was learning. I was so tired that I didn't have time to criticize myself in my head. Like, that was how tired I was, you guys. So it's definitely not for someone who is looking for a vacation, let's say, especially if you are there to really want to get fluent and you're not just dabbling or doing something non-committal. Another con is it's definitely hard to figure out how you want to continue after that intense language experience immersion is over. Because I will say, after I stopped learning Turkish in Turkey, I actually stopped for a good, 2 or 3 months, even speaking Turkish at all. So I went from studying the language, anywhere from 4 to 6 hours a day, to not doing anything with it. And it can be discouraging when you are in a really intensive experience, you witness yourself, your progress that is super, super fast. You're like, this is all that I wanted. It feels great. And you see others acknowledging that too about yourself. And then you go, wherever else after the experience is over. And then you're like, someone just commented under my video that I'm an A2 in Turkish, which actually happened, by the way. I'm not going to sit here and hide the fact that it does feel discouraging, right? To work really hard and then not have a constant routine and wanting to prioritize actually different things away from learning that language that you were learning in that intensive environment. And then you still come and you show how your level has become after that intensive experience, after a break. And then people are still like, you're an A2. And I'm telling you guys this part because it is an honest part of the language learning journey, especially if you are putting yourself out online for everyone to judge, and for everyone to judge who has not seen all of the behind the scenes of what you have or haven't done in the language too. But I will say, definitely a huge pro of this is you do get really, really fast to your language goals, a lot faster than you would be. Of course, if you were solo studying maybe an hour per day or every other day in your home country. I never thought that I would pass even an exam in Turkish in B2 because I felt so distraught over thinking that I was doomed to just stay at B1. Not that having an intermediate level and staying at that intermediate level is anything bad. However, I had intentions of really wanting to get to advanced. And literally, you guys, in just 5 weeks, I am not exaggerating, like I went from B1 to a solid B2. Another pro is definitely you have someone else to do this for you. Obviously not do everything for you, right? But I think that we as solo language learners spend a lot of time organizing and trying to figure out what's the best order to learn our language. What are my weak points? Like, what do I need to work on? Is my pronunciation right? Like, you get so much instant feedback that you wouldn't be getting if you were studying by yourself. And that means you spend a lot less emotional and mental stress worried about second guessing your decisions that you make about your language learning. Another pro that goes into that is that you definitely get to experience the language like every day. So much to the point that you start to take it for granted. I remember when I would solo study languages at home, and especially Turkish, and I would just wish, I wish I just had more Turkish around me. And that's automatically what you get, even though it may not be 100% an immersive experience if people keep on speaking English to you. But still, you get to hear it in the streets. You get to hear it from neighbors talking to themselves or kids trying to talk to you. Plus, you get more input naturally and start to just piece together more intuitively what the language is, right? What structures you might have had trouble with in the past, but you're being able to put them together in your head now because you have that natural input around you. And also, for those who usually avoid doing things in their language learning studies, like me sometimes, being in the country of the language itself and actually committing yourself to some kind of program or course, that is really good for when you need to force yourself to do things, right? Sometimes you just don't have a choice. And probably the biggest pro of it all is that I got to see other people being vulnerable. And what do I mean by this? Because I've talked about it in a few of my videos, but vulnerability is truly one of the keys of long-term success and fulfillment in your language learning journey, right? Because we usually see people, if maybe we have a class with them 1 hour or 2 hours max per week in our home country. Maybe you've gone to a language event where you do a language exchange and you see typically people on a very certain part of their language journeys. It never really occurred to me that while in a school where you see each other for 3 months on end and you see each other 4 hours a day, obviously all of the celebrations and wins, right? Like you get to be a witness of their progress as much as they are a witness to yours in the language, but you also see them clearly frustrated, or you also see them clearly not understanding something, even though you know that they speak well. And it's just been very refreshing to see that in other language learners because, again, when we are online, when we are solo language learning, just at home organizing everything, we look to the internet for inspiration usually, and we get to see how people want to present themselves. But in a class of such a long period of time that's so intense, there are definitely going to be frustrations. There are definitely times that you're going to witness other people question themselves. And I think in solo language learning, we do so much of that in isolation that we think that we're the only ones experiencing all of the emotions, when actually being in a group class in an intensive setting proves the exact opposite. And it's a great reminder to see everyone else on, having to confront themselves in a really vulnerable way that you wouldn't have necessarily seen them do if you guys weren't in class together like 4 hours a day. Then it really encourages me to keep on facing my own sort of vulnerabilities, right, in order to keep on growing in the language and also just grow as a human being, as part of, or I guess just making language learning just a part of the whole self-development journey that we're all on. My advice is definitely, if you ever have the chance, please do an immersive sort of program. And it doesn't have to be for 3 months. It can only be for a week, right? But it is a one-of-a-kind experience, especially for language learners. And even though I started with a lot of cons at the beginning, trust me, you don't have to feel bad for me. Everything that I felt like I was lacking in Turkey and that made me sad about the language learning experience, I definitely got to make up for while I have been in Jordan. And yes, you know, the experience is what you make of it to an extent. And it also means that you are definitely going to overcome the challenges that you will inevitably face. Because again, you willfully put yourself into a learning environment, you build a layer of resilience on your language journey that way too. I would also suggest coming up with a plan in advance for how you are going to continue your learning experience after the intense experience is over. Because yes, there is room to change this up, right? But at least having something in place for you to work off of, even just planning to maybe the second to last week of your intensive course, asking your teacher, hey, where do you see me with my honest progress right now? What do you recommend me do? Also, highly recommend talking easy to yourself while you are on this journey, because it will test you, parts of you, like no other. Definitely has for me, and I'm on this has been like my 7th or 8th language. So you're gonna keep on finding out different things, new things about yourself, new ways that you're going to react to different or maybe similar situations that you've been in with the past. I've definitely been in a language learning classroom before, but here I am doing it all over again, and I'm having a totally different experience, even though it is in a similar environment in the classroom. So just be kind to yourself, because I think that I would have had a much worse experience in Turkey if, on top of everything else and feeling that really big disconnect from other people, I had talked to myself in a way that was like opposite of being my own friend, right? So saying, you're so stupid, like, why are you even here, etc. Showing some compassion and grace to yourself and saying, hey, it's okay, we're gonna try again tomorrow, and we're just gonna show up how we're gonna show up. It doesn't even have to be like #1 fan of yourself, right? It can just be, again, what we had been talking about before, being an observer of your surroundings, of yourself, of your own thoughts about how you think about your own language learning and how you talk to yourself, right? And it'll take off a lot more of the mental energy that you're dedicating to criticizing yourself, and instead helping you take more of that energy and putting it into actual learning. I also recommend to not use this and think of it as the one ultimate magic ticket to fluency, to confidence, to whatever you want to accomplish in your language learning. There's always a really big danger of assuming that any one method is going to get you to whatever your goal is. You're already setting up that expectation for yourself that only that one thing is going to mean success, not only right now for my fluency, but also in the future for any languages that I want to get fluent in, right? So you're setting up that expectation, and then maybe when you can't do the same thing in the future for another language, then that can automatically feel discouraging to you. As I said before, there's a lot of ways to be creative throughout our lives with how we approach language learning, and we need to give ourselves permission to be able to explore what that might look like and not always go back to the same thing that may or may not work for a new language, depending on our life circumstance or our mentality or our energy. I want to hear your biggest takeaway from from listening to me talk your ears off, basically, for this video, and we will see each other in another video soon.